Hi, my name's James. A little context. A student here at the U and taking a class called Diverse Christian Perspectives on Issues in the 21st Century. And for this last week's class discussion, it was on homosexuality, and our discussion post was on that, but more broadly was one of the readings we had argued from a more liberal point of view that when conservative Christians interact with churches who do not believe that homosexuality is a sin, they change their mind. And conservative Christians would more land or use the Bible typically to argue that homosexuality is a sin. So my question is, how do you balance human experience and the interaction with other image bearers of God and the teachings and doctrines of Scripture?
Yeah, I think, in fact, I could give you, do you want me to give you a very, geeky answer? There's this thing called the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, and I'll do this to kind of, I'm not going to test anyone over this, so you don't have to take notes. But it's a way that in the 19th or 20th century, a theologian by the name of Albert Outler tried and explain to people how John Wesley did theology. So he argued that Wesley would look at four things when he determined what should the Christian faith teach. And it was what Scripture says, what tradition of the church has said, what our own experience has shown us, and really what he meant by that was, is it something that's actually livable? And then the fourth thing was, is all of these reasonable? Like, have I interpreted Scripture reasonably? Have I interpreted tradition reasonably? Am I interpreting my own experience reasonably? And what happened was that got taken, and people started to run away with that. So that now you had these kind of like four squares, and each one gets one vote. And so you say, how should we respond to this? Well, Scripture says this, but the other three say something different, therefore it's going to be the other three. And Outler would later say he wished he'd never coined the phrase Wesleyan Quadrilateral, because he said that's clearly not how Wesley did it. Scripture was always at the top. What does the Bible say? Well, how do I know that I'm interpreting the Bible correctly? Well, what does tradition say? How have other Christians interpreted this over the years? And finally, is this something that turns out to be livable? And then, have I been reasonable in the way that I've asked these questions? And so that's the way that we have actually should be doing, if we're going to do the quadrilateral. That's the way we should be doing it. I think for a lot of Christians, going to the specifics of your case, I think the problem is not that they read the Bible and it said this, and they met someone who was gay, and they're like, I didn't realize. I think the problem is they weren't viewing homosexuality from the Scripture to begin with, but they were probably viewing it from a lens of homophobia. And then when they met someone who was gay, they realized, well, man, persons who are gay are not who I thought they were. And the Scripture for them was just a proof text anyway. They didn't actually understand why it was saying what it was saying. What's the point that's actually going on here? And I think that's been the problem for a lot of people, is it's not that they view homosexuality the way they do because the Scripture talks about same-sex behavior as sin, but it's because they are afraid of people who engage in this behavior. And then when they meet someone, they realize you don't have to be. And so they were already doing it from the wrong place anyway, at least in my opinion.
A follow-up on that, just that I was thinking.
Yeah.
I love that perspective because I do think that I think you could probably find that in so many areas of Scripture, but to maybe, this is where my mind went, and maybe for some people connecting the dots, for somebody who is living in, let's say, a sin that is different than that, but maybe along the same vein of someone who struggles with pornography. That person may be an amazing person, and maybe even an amazing boyfriend or girlfriend, or an amazing mother or father, or an amazing fill in the blank. My dad, he knew his grandfather to be his hero, but his mother, my grandmother, knew him to be abusive. And he was a different person to different people. And I think to the point of what Dr. Tennison is talking about, I think there's a lot of times where we as Christians, whatever the issue is, we immediately will put everyone else in a box because of our previous experience or lack thereof previous experience. Maybe I've never known a drug addict, and so I assume that the drug addict is the person that I saw on the TV, or the person that my friend told me about, or maybe I do know somebody, and that's the frame. I think a lot of times people struggle with that because of the word father. When they say, my father, he was a wicked man. I could never have a relationship with a God who's a creator than someone who calls himself father. And so I think that that issue, brilliantly brought up, is something that, people who are full of faith, people who would call themselves Christians, are victims of far too often, because we put ourselves in different places and put other people in different places and boxes the way that we see the world, not the way that God sees the world. And the things that separate us from him are really what are his ailments and his recommendations and his laws. I don't want you to be separate from me. It's not about your relationship necessarily with others. It's about, what is it that's separate from me? And then we say, oh, yeah, that person. And I think, we look at the scripture, why are you pointing out a speck in someone else's eye when you have a log in your own? But am I, from a doctorate of theology, am I on somewhat of a right track here? Does that seem to resonate with maybe some of the issues that we go through, not just that one specifically?
Well, I do think that's the case that we don't sum up somebody based on one particular behavior. But we can recognize how damaging a particular behavior is. Sure. And we learn to separate those two things. And again, I call out the behavior not because I'm rejecting you, it's because I care about you. Yeah. And I've got to call out a damaging behavior because you matter. And because this isn't who you are called to be, this isn't who you were created to be. I don't know if that's kind of what you're...
Yeah.